Sometimes, when the night is at its quietest, the ghosts of our past find ways to follow us, whispering at the edge of sleep, lurking in the faintest shadows. Evan Hayes knew this all too well. He arrived in the sleepy rural town of Wyndham Hollow just after dawn, his truck heavy with all he owned. A battered duffel, a few boxes of worn clothes, and a collection of memories he'd spent years trying to leave behind. The landscape was a patchwork of rolling fields, stone walls buried under moss, and stretches of old, half-wild woods that seemed to breathe with every gust of early autumn wind. The air tasted of damp leaves and wood smoke, a scent both comforting and strangely bittersweet. Evan's new cottage was nothing grand, a faded blue clapboard house that sat a little crooked on its foundation, tucked away behind tangled hedgerows and a stand of towering maples. He didn't need much. After decades running headlong into burning buildings, a life pared down to the essentials felt like a kind of relief. He unloaded his things in silence, listening to the crunch of gravel beneath his boots and the low murmur of crows settling in the trees. There was a hush in the air, the kind that comes before the world wakes up fully. Evan tried not to think of the empty passenger seat or the little brass medallion he still wore around his neck, hidden beneath his shirt, a token from another life, a life that burned away in a single night. He set about making the cottage his own, hanging a battered fireman's helmet on a nail by the door, tucking photographs of his family into a drawer he'd rarely open. By noon, he'd swept away the dust, stacked his books on crooked shelves, and brewed a pot of strong coffee. For the first time in months, he felt almost at peace. But it was later, as the sun dipped behind the woods, that Evan noticed something peculiar beyond the low stone wall marking the edge of his property. At first, it seemed just a shape, tall, dark, and motionless, standing by the side of the derelict barn next door. The barn itself was a husk of weathered wood, its roof sagging, boards warped and silvered by time. Ivy climbed its sides in thick, tangled ropes. No lights, no signs of life, just this lone figure, poised like a sentry. Evan squinted through the shifting gold of the evening light, trying to make sense of what he saw. As his eyes adjusted, the figure resolved into a horse, jet black, with a proud arch to its neck and a tail like a plume of midnight. The animal stood utterly still, muscles tensed beneath a gleaming coat, its gaze fixed on the barn as if waiting for something only it could see. The sight unsettled Evan in a way he couldn't explain. He'd seen horses before, of course, but something about this one, its silent vigilance, the unwavering way it faced the barn, felt different. It seemed less a creature of flesh and blood than a living question, poised in the dying light. He watched for a long while, the silence broken only by the distant lowing of cows and the soft whistle of wind through the grass. Night crept in, bringing with it the first hints of frost. Evan drew the curtains, telling himself he'd imagined the tension in the air, the sense of being watched. But sleep didn't come easily. When he finally drifted off, his dreams were troubled. Visions of flames licking at dark rafters, the sharp scent of smoke, the sound of a horse's hooves pounding in the dark. Morning came, gray and cold, the fields silvered with dew. Evan brewed another pot of coffee and stepped out onto the porch, expecting to see the world return to normal. But there, just as before, the black Mustang stood in its silent vigil, unmoving except for the occasional flick of its tail. Evan felt a jolt of recognition, a kinship, perhaps, between two creatures both displaced, both nursing wounds the world couldn't see. He decided to walk the perimeter, boots soaking through with dew, hands thrust deep in his pockets. The closer he came to the barn, the clearer the details became. The Mustang was a magnificent animal, tall, well-muscled, eyes dark and bright with a strange, haunted intelligence. A single white blaze ran down its face, a splash of moonlight against the black. It didn't shy away as Evan approached, but neither did it acknowledge him, remaining locked in its vigil. Evan leaned against the stone wall, studying the barn. Shutters hung askew. The door sagged on its hinges. On the breeze, he caught the scent of old hay, the earthy musk of horse, and something else. Something sharp, metallic, and vaguely electric, like a memory waiting to be unearthed. He found himself wondering about the animal's owner. The property had been empty for years, the locals said, ever since the last of the Barrett family moved away. The barn was a relic, a leftover from another era. And yet, the Mustang remained, as if bound to the spot by duty or grief or both. That night, as the wind howled around the eaves and the old house creaked with settling bones, Evan couldn't shake the image of the black horse standing guard at the barn. It seemed to be waiting for something, or someone, that would never return. As he lay awake, listening to the sighing of the trees, Evan felt the weight of his own loss pressing down on him, heavy as the night itself. He didn't know it yet, but the story of the Mustang and the abandoned barn would soon entwine with his own in ways he could never have imagined. And as the first flakes of autumn snow began to fall, the old secrets of Barrett Barn stirred, restless and unresolved, ready to be awakened by a stranger's touch. As the days in Wyndham Hollow quietly bled into each other, Evan Hayes found himself drawn, almost magnetically, to the battered old barn and the black Mustang who seemed to haunt its edges. The town, with its unhurried rhythms and weathered faces, offered a kind of peace he hadn't known in years, but there was a sense of unfinished business lingering in the air. It clung to the barn like mist, and to the Mustang, midnight, as he soon learned the locals called him, like a second skin. Evan became a familiar figure along the rutted path that skirted the boundary between his cottage and the Barrett property. Each morning, before the sun fully warmed the dew from the grass, he'd stand by the low stone wall and watch. Midnight always arrived just before dawn, moving with a silent, spectral grace from the shadowy tree line to the front of the barn. There, the horse would stand perfectly still, sometimes for hours at a time, his head high, muscles tense beneath the sheen of his black coat. He looked less like an animal and more like a sentinel or a guardian posted on eternal watch. Wyndham Hollow, for all its small-town stillness, wasn't without its mysteries or its gossip. Evan listened quietly whenever he stopped at the corner store, picking up coffee or bread, careful not to invite too much curiosity about himself. Yet the regulars were eager to talk, especially about midnight and the Barrett barn. Some insisted the horse was a stray, drawn by some forgotten scent or memory. Others, lowering their voices, hinted at stranger things. They said the barn was cursed, marked by a tragedy that no one wanted to name out loud. Evan could see the story written in the way Midnight kept himself apart, refusing all company. Even the local herd, a half-dozen placid draft horses, gave the Mustang a wide berth. At night, the other animals clustered together for warmth in the lower field. But Midnight remained solitary, eyes fixed on the barn, heedless of wind, rain, or the lonely call of distant coyotes. There was something about the horse's posture, a dignity, a silent yearning, that tugged at Evan's own bruised heart. He found himself inventing reasons to linger outside, splitting wood, raking leaves, or simply sitting on his porch with a mug of coffee, watching the world unfold around him. The Mustang became a silent companion to his days, an anchor in the stillness. Sometimes, Evan would speak softly over the distance, not expecting a reply, just sending words into the cool morning air. But midnight never turned, never flicked an ear, never broke from his endless vigil. Occasionally, when the town was still and the wind carried just the right tune, Evan imagined he could sense something else, a kind of presence, ancient and restless, swirling in the barn's shadows. One evening, as dusk settled and the horizon glowed gold and violet, he noticed the way Midnight's eyes seemed to glisten, reflecting not just the fading light, but an old sorrow buried deep within. The horse's stance spoke of longing and grief, emotions Evan recognized with aching clarity. Driven by curiosity and a budding sense of kinship, Evan tried to offer comfort. He brought fresh apples, their skins shiny and red, and set them on the flat stones near the barn. He left out a bucket of water, cleaned and refilled each day. He even tried speaking gently, his voice a low, steady murmur. Still, the Mustang ignored every gesture, keeping his distance, accepting neither food nor affection. If Evan stepped too close, Midnight would simply retreat, unhurried and proud, melting back into the twilight like a wisp of smoke. Rumors continued to swirl in town. People speculated that Midnight was the ghost of a horse lost long ago, or a remnant from the Barrett's vanished era. Evan listened but reserved judgment, preferring to trust what he saw with his own eyes. Yet he couldn't deny the horse's presence carried a kind of gravity, drawing both wonder and unease from everyone who saw him. As October deepened and the nights grew longer, a subtle change came over the landscape. Frost rimmed the grass at dawn. The maples blazed with color, their leaves carpeting the ground in fiery reds and golds. The barn stood at the center of it all, its windows reflecting the sun's pale light, like the blank eyes of an old, blind giant. Midnight remained unwavering, faithful to his post, unmoved by the changing world. Evan's fascination grew into something deeper, an almost compulsive empathy. He understood what it meant to linger, caught between what was lost and what might come. Sometimes, in the stillest hours before dawn, he would wake from restless dreams and stare out the window, half expecting to see Midnight's silhouette etched against the night. And more often than not, the Mustang would be there, silent as a secret, holding fast to the memory of something precious and gone. Evan made a silent vow. He would uncover Midnight's story, whatever it cost. The horse's loneliness called out to his own. And though he didn't know it yet, the search for the truth behind that unblinking vigil would change everything. Not just for the Mustang, but for the old Barrett property, and for Evan himself, in the hush of Windham Hollow, where even the air seemed to carry secrets. The bond between a broken man and a haunted horse was only beginning to take shape. As the days drifted by in Windham Hollow, Evan Hayes found his life gradually aligning with the rhythm of the Mustang's mysterious vigil. The crisp autumn air had acquired a sharper bite, and the mornings now began with a silver veil of fog that clung low over the meadows, blurring the line between waking and dreaming. It was during these early hours that Evan felt the pull of the barn most strongly, a silent compulsion to bear witness to whatever was unfolding at its threshold. Though Evan tried to carry on with simple chores, chopping firewood, repairing a sagging gutter, stacking wood for the winter, his attention never strayed far from the dilapidated structure across the field. Midnight, the black Mustang, continued his ritual, unwavering and untouchable, keeping his distance from everyone and everything. There was a growing tension in the air, an invisible thread connecting man and animal, tightening a little each time Evan attempted to bridge the gap between them. After weeks of quietly observing, Evan's curiosity had become something deeper, a sense of duty, almost paternal, as if he'd been tasked with safeguarding a secret he didn't yet understand. He began to leave offerings by the wall, a handful of crisp apples from a neighbor's orchard, a pile of sweet hay, a bucket of fresh water, cool and clear. Evan always retreated to a respectful distance, settling onto a smooth rock or leaning against the ancient wall, his presence more a gentle suggestion than an intrusion. He watched as the Mustang glanced sideways at the apples, nostrils flaring at the scent, but always turned away with a kind of solemn dignity, refusing any handouts, accepting neither comfort nor charity. There were days when Evan felt foolish, caught in a strange, silent standoff with a creature that seemed both fiercely independent and unbearably sad. He wondered what memories haunted Midnight, what loss or promise kept the animal chained to this place. The stories swirling around town had only grown more colorful. At the general store, a wiry old man swore he'd seen ghostly lights drifting through the barn's hayloft at midnight, while a pair of sisters whispered about strange footprints appearing in the mud after every full moon. Others claimed to hear the muffled sound of hooves late at night, echoing down empty lanes, as if midnight was waiting for someone or something that never arrived. Despite the superstitions, Evan trusted his instincts. There was a reason for Midnight's vigilance, a story buried beneath layers of dust and time. Each failed attempt to befriend the horse only deepened Evan's resolve. The Mustang's wariness felt familiar, like looking in a mirror. After all, Evan had built his own walls, invisible but just as formidable. The season turned, and with it came the first real taste of winter. One evening, as a cold rain fell in heavy sheets, Evan spotted Midnight standing in the downpour, head lowered, coat slick with water, yet refusing the shelter of the barn. The sight sparked a jolt of concern in Evan. He hurried across the sodden grass, rain stinging his face, calling softly to the Mustang, trying to coax him toward cover. But Midnight only shifted his weight, muscles tense, ears flattened, eyes wary and wild. No matter how much Evan pleaded, the horse remained rooted to the spot, as if compelled by some invisible force. Later, alone by the fire, Evan replayed the encounter, searching for meaning in the horse's stubbornness. It struck him that Midnight wasn't simply avoiding people. He was guarding something, or perhaps standing sentinel for a memory only he understood. That night, Evan's dreams were uneasy, filled with images of storm-lashed fields, shadows flitting through broken beams, and the sound of distant hoofbeats echoing like thunder. The next day, driven by both worry and the need to unravel the growing enigma, Evan sought out more information. He stopped by the post office, then the library, piecing together scraps of local history. The Barrett family, he learned, had once been prominent in the region, landowners, horse breeders, and rumored to have served with distinction in the cavalry generations ago. But tragedy had struck, decades back. A fire in the barn, a young soldier lost at war, a grieving sweetheart left behind. Afterward, the family's fortunes dwindled, the house sold off, the barn abandoned. Only rumors and memories remained, carried in whispers and glances. As Evan read between the lines of fading newspaper clippings and yellowed letters, a sense of purpose grew within him. Midnight, he realized, was the last living thread tying past to present, his loyalty unbroken by time or loss. The more Evan learned, the more he saw Midnight's sorrow reflected in the empty spaces of his own life. The barn wasn't just a building. It was a monument to unfinished stories, a place where hope and heartbreak lingered like dust motes in the morning light. Determined to help, Evan began to spend more time near the barn, careful never to cross the boundary Midnight had drawn. He watched the Mustang from afar, offering quiet companionship, letting trust build at its own stubborn pace. Still, Midnight kept his distance, his eyes full of secrets and old wounds, his vigil unbroken even as the first flurries of snow dusted the fields. Evan understood now. The horse was waiting, not for food or comfort, but for an answer. Or perhaps for someone brave enough to search for the truth. The story was out there, buried in the bones of the barn and the hearts of those who remembered. All it needed was a spark to bring it to light. And Evan, haunted by his own losses, felt ready at last to follow where the mystery led, no matter how deep or dark the path became. It began with the kind of restless wind that warns of trouble. By late afternoon, the sky over Windham Hollow was smeared with bruised purple and angry gray. The air thick and oddly charged. The trees bent and whispered as if sharing secrets about the coming storm. Evan, already uneasy from the way Midnight had paced all morning, could feel the pressure dropping, felt it in his bones, the way old wounds ache before rain. He stepped onto his porch, coffee in hand, and glanced toward the barn. The black Mustang was there, no longer statuesque and silent but agitated, hooves stamping and mane tossing, the tension visible from 100 yards away. By sunset, the clouds pressed lower, rolling across the hills in a churning mass. The first fat raindrops smacked the leaves, and a peal of thunder rattled windows up and down the valley. Most of the town hunkered down, closing shutters and double-checking lanterns and flashlights. But Evan stood at his door, eyes locked on Midnight, who now circled the front of the barn, snorting and tossing his head, nostrils wide and wild. Something was different. The Mustang's anxiety was palpable, far beyond anything Evan had seen in the weeks prior. He knew horses could sense storms, but this seemed like something else, an old fear or a memory rekindled by the crack of thunder and the rising wind. Driven by instinct and a sense of urgent responsibility, Evan pulled on his raincoat and boots, grabbed a flashlight, and plunged into the storm. The wind battered him as he crossed the field, the rain already turning the ground to mud beneath his feet. He called softly to Midnight, voice barely audible above the roar, but the Mustang's eyes were fixed on the barn door, ears pinned back, body trembling. Evan tried to edge closer, hands open, hoping to coax the horse toward shelter. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the ruined barn in stark white light. For a split second, Evan thought he saw something move in one of the upper windows, a flash of white, gone before he could register if it was real or only a trick of the storm. He forced himself onward, boots squelching through standing water. Midnight reared and backed away at first. Then, as another jagged bolt of lightning crashed nearby, the horse let out a piercing whinny, so desperate, so human in its fear, that it sent chills down Evan's spine. He pressed forward, speaking in soothing tones, making himself as small and unthreatening as possible. After a long moment, Midnight's panic broke and he bolted toward the barn door, pushing past Evan and disappearing into the dark. Without thinking, Evan followed, ducking through the battered doorway just as the rain intensified. The interior was cold and musty, filled with the sharp scents of wet earth and rotting hay. His flashlight beam bounced along broken beams and scattered debris, catching the glint of Midnight's eyes as the horse pawed at the packed dirt, nostrils flaring, wild but not aggressive. Thunder boomed, shaking dust from the rafters. The barn seemed to groan under the weight of the storm and years of neglect. Evan swept his light across the space, seeing details he hadn't noticed in the daylight. Rusted tools hung on the walls, cobwebs as thick as curtains. A ladder, old but sturdy, rose along the far wall to a hayloft above. Midnight snorted again, his anxiety shifting as the pounding rain muffled outside sounds, and the barn became a sanctuary instead of a tomb. As Evan worked to calm his own heart, he became aware of a draft, a cold breath of air swirling from above. He pointed his flashlight up, tracing the wooden beams until he saw a hatchway to the loft, half obscured by old sacks and fallen boards. The wind had pushed something loose, perhaps the very thing that had frightened Midnight before the storm broke. Guided by equal parts curiosity and concern, Evan climbed the creaking ladder, each step echoing as the wind howled outside. The loft was cloaked in shadow, but Evan's light revealed more than he expected. Not just hay and dust, but relics untouched for decades. An old cavalry saddle, its leather cracked but ornate, rested atop a pile of faded blankets. The insignia on the cantle was worn yet still legible, a testament to pride and honor from another time. Nearby, a tattered military blanket was folded with a kind of reverence. Most intriguing, though, was a small wooden chest tucked into a corner. Inside, Evan found a journal. Its cover softened with age, the pages yellowed but intact, and the looping handwriting of someone from a different era. A sharp gust rattled the barn, snapping Evan out of his trance. He tucked the journal under his arm, descending the ladder just as Midnight stamped below, now calmer but still vigilant. The storm outside raged, yet inside a hush had fallen. The discovery felt momentous, an answer or the start of one, waiting in the fragile pages he now carried. Evan waited out the worst of the storm in the barn, Midnight nearby, both man and horse sheltering in the ruins of old sorrow and new hope. When the rain finally lessened, Evan knew the story had changed. He no longer saw the barn as a symbol of decay, nor the Mustang as just a ghost from someone else's tragedy. They were both witnesses, guardians of a secret about to come into the light. As he walked back toward his cottage, journal pressed tightly to his chest, Evan felt a strange electricity in the air, something more than the fading storm. The answer was close. He just needed the courage to look. The storm left the countryside washed and glistening, every leaf and blade of grass heavy with droplets that reflected the weak, apologetic light of dawn. Evan Hayes woke early, the memory of thunder still echoing in his bones, the events of the previous night vivid and electric in his mind. He sat at his kitchen table, nursing a mug of coffee as he stared at the weathered journal he had retrieved from the hayloft. It sat on the wood between his hands, a bridge to another lifetime, mysterious and expectant. He hesitated before opening it, reluctant to intrude upon a stranger's private thoughts, yet deeply compelled. The cover was soft and smooth from years of handling, embossed with the initials TB. As Evan cracked it open, the pages released the faintest scent of dust and cedar, a breath of history curling into the present. The handwriting inside was strong and steady, looping across the page in faded ink. The first entries were simple and methodical, lists of chores, brief accounts of weather, mentions of repairs, and the comings and goings on the Barrett property. But as Evan read on, the voice behind the words grew richer, more urgent. The author was Thomas Barrett, a young cavalryman who wrote with the clarity of someone keenly aware of time slipping by. Thomas wrote often of his horse, a black Mustang named Storm, whose speed and loyalty he described with reverence. There were stories of long rides beneath moonlit skies, of breaking wild colts and racing the wind along the ridgelines above the farm. Evan imagined the connection between horse and man, the trust, the silent communication, the way a simple touch or whispered word could calm a skittish animal or send it flying over fences for sheer joy. But the journal was more than a catalogue of country life. Soon, another name appeared in its pages: Clara. Thomas wrote of her with an affection that glowed in every line. Clara had grown up next door, their childhood friendship blossoming into something deeper as they came of age. She had a laugh that reminded him of summer thunder, eyes the color of the lake at sunset. The two of them dreamed together, of a future, of a world beyond the valley, of a life unshadowed by war. The entries grew heavier as the world changed. War was coming. Thomas, restless with duty, signed up, his sense of honor and obligation leaping off the page. He wrote about his fears, about the promise he'd made to Clara, that he would return. There was a letter tucked between the pages, its edges curled, the words smudged in places by what Evan guessed were Clara's tears. She had written after Thomas left, pouring out her heart, hoping her words would find him across miles and months. As Evan read, the isolation of the barn and the silent figure of midnight outside took on new weight. Was the Mustang truly Storm, the same loyal companion who had once carried Thomas over hill and valley, through drills and parades and tearful farewells? It seemed impossible, yet the horse's devotion to the barn and the ache in his eyes hinted at something that could not be explained away by time or logic. The community's stories of a cursed barn and a ghostly horse no longer seemed like idle superstition, but echoes of real heartbreak. Late that morning, Evan ventured to the barn once more, journal in hand. Midnight stood beneath the eaves, eyes following every move. Evan knelt by the open door, reading passages aloud, not for the horse's sake, he told himself, but to break the silence, to fill the space with a story that had waited too long in the dark. He spoke of Thomas's longing for home, his sleepless nights filled with thoughts of Clara and the fields he missed. The journal recounted a final entry, hurried and heavy. Thomas preparing to ride out with his regiment, the sound of cannon fire rumbling on the horizon, his last words a vow to come back to the ones he loved. There was no further entry after that. Evan could feel the weight of what must have followed. News that never came. A letter that never arrived. Clara waiting until hope faded to grief. The barn had stood silent witness to her loss, the Mustang left behind, searching the horizon for a rider who would never return. Evan felt his own losses stirring within him, drawn up by the shape of Thomas's story, the echo of Clara's sorrow. He saw now that midnight's vigil was not mere habit, but the shape grief had taken, unyielding, patient, eternal. The barn, once just a relic, now seemed charged with meaning, its old boards holding the imprint of love and loss and memory. With the past beginning to come into focus, Evan's empathy sharpened. He resolved to dig deeper, to find out what had happened to Clara and to anyone who remained. If the story had roots in the living world, perhaps there was a way to bring peace to the restless Mustang and to himself. That afternoon, the storm clouds broke for good, sunlight spilling over the hills, making the world new and bright. Evan stood at the barn's entrance, journal pressed to his heart. Feeling the wind shift around him, Midnight watched, as if sensing that a boundary had been crossed, that an old sorrow was finally being named. And in that fragile golden hour, Evan felt, for the first time, a glimmer of hope, the sense that the story was not over, but waiting for its next chapter. The following days found Evan Hayes moving through his routines with a new sense of gravity. The journal had awakened something inside him, a purpose, a mission larger than himself and his own wounds. The words of Thomas Barrett echoed in his mind, their edges raw and honest, drawing Evan back again and again to the barn, as if he might find more answers in its shadows. Outside, autumn tightened its grip on Windham Hollow. Mornings arrived laced with frost, and the fields shone white before the sun could melt the chill. The leaves, once bright with fire, had begun to fall in earnest, blanketing the ground in a crackling tapestry. Yet Midnight, faithful as ever, kept his post near the barn, head lowered in silent patience, the wind tugging at his black mane. He moved with a quiet dignity that spoke to Evan more than words ever could, a creature made not only of flesh and bone, but of loyalty and sorrow. Evan's nights were no longer restful. Sleep brought dreams of Clara waiting at the window, her eyes fixed on the horizon, the distant thunder of hooves echoing like heartbeats. He imagined the pain that had crept into her days, the slow erosion of hope, the way grief hollowed her out until she was left with only memories and the old barn as her silent witness. It became clear to Evan, the story wasn't just about Thomas and Storm, but about Clara's suffering and the Mustang's devotion to a life that had slipped away. He spent hours reading and rereading the journal, letting its heartbreak and hope seep into his bones. Thomas's entries shifted as the war grew nearer, his tone changing from confident to anxious, from hopeful to haunted. He wrote about the uncertainty of every morning, about the faces of friends who vanished into the mist of battle, and about the letter he kept close to his heart. Clara's handwriting, her words a lifeline in a world unraveling. Storm, the Mustang, remained his constant. No matter the chaos or danger, the horse's presence grounded Thomas, kept him tethered to memories of home and love. The final entries were a mixture of resolve and resignation. Thomas recounted a brief return home, a leave taken just before a major battle. The writing turned tender as he described meeting Clara beneath the old willow by the stream, both of them stealing moments of happiness from the relentless march of fate. There was a proposal, simple and honest, made in the hush of twilight, and a promise exchanged beneath the stars. Clara had cried that night, and Thomas wrote that he would do anything to return to her, to build the future they dreamed of. Evan could feel the ache in those words, the weight of dreams too fragile to survive the world's cruelties. The last pages of the journal, hurried and scrawled, told of Thomas's departure. He described riding Storm into the pre-dawn darkness, the sound of Clara's voice in his ear, the image of her face the last thing he carried into the fog of war. There were no more entries after that, no record of his fate, only the echo of his promise. Haunted by the gaps in the story, Evan wandered through the barn, searching for more clues. He touched the rough wood where Clara might have leaned, stood in the silent loft, breathing the dust that still smelled faintly of hay and leather and longing. He could almost see her there, clutching Thomas's last letter, waiting as the seasons changed and hope faded. He pictured the Mustang too, Storm, standing at the gate, ears pricked, waiting for the sound of footsteps that never came. It struck Evan how grief can shape a place, how the energy of loss lingers in walls, in earth, in the memory of animals who loved without question. The barn, for all its crumbling and rot, felt hallowed, a vessel for the unfinished business of hearts left behind. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and cast long shadows across the valley, Evan sat outside the barn and read Thomas's journal aloud, letting the words drift into the air, letting midnight hear the story that had shaped his world. The Mustang stood still, head bowed as if in reverence, the muscles along his flanks twitching with the memory of long-ago thunder. For a moment, Evan thought he saw understanding in the animal's eyes, a flicker of memory, of recognition. As dusk settled, Evan felt a shift within himself too. His own pain, long suppressed and smoldering, began to loosen. He realized that by tending to midnight and to the story of Thomas and Clara, he was also tending to his own wounds, finding purpose in the act of remembering, of bearing witness. He saw that love and loss, no matter how old, could bind people and animals across time, shaping destinies in ways neither logic nor reason could fully explain. That evening, as stars pricked the cold sky, Evan lingered in the barn's doorway, letting the silence wrap around him. Midnight remained near, and for the first time, the horse stepped a little closer, his breath steaming in the frosty air. Evan reached out, not expecting contact, but this time Midnight did not flinch. He simply stood, eyes bright in the darkness, the distance between man and animal just a little smaller. In that moment, Evan understood. Some stories wait generations for someone to finish telling them. And in the stillness of Windham Hollow, beneath the watchful gaze of midnight, a tale of love and loss was slowly, finally, coming home. Evan Hayes had always believed that stories, no matter how old, never truly ended. They rippled through time, waiting for someone to pick up the thread. Now, with the past flickering to life through Thomas Barrett's journal, Evan was determined to finish what had been started decades earlier. He spent his days haunted by questions. What became of Clara after Thomas disappeared? Did anyone remain who could help piece together the fragments of their tragedy? And could the key to Midnight's heartbreak still be found in the living world? He returned to the small local library, cradling the worn journal, hungry for answers. The librarian, a woman with silver hair and a memory for every face in Windham Hollow, recognized the Barrett name instantly. She sifted through county records and dust-caked newspapers, her hands sure and steady as she unearthed birth notices, wedding announcements, and faded obituaries. Names leapt from the pages. Clara Evans Barrett, her marriage to Thomas never formally recorded. Her own obituary marked with an unusual note, survived by one granddaughter, Emily Barrett. Evan felt a surge of hope and dread. The past was not completely lost. He pressed the librarian for more, and together they found a recent property transaction. The Barrett homestead, barn and all, had indeed passed to Emily Barrett, who lived out of state but was preparing to sell the place after her own divorce. The details struck Evan with uncanny familiarity. He realized the for sale sign he'd seen by the main road was for this very property. He spent hours wandering the fields, letting the information settle. The more he learned, the more he sensed that Midnight's vigil was bound to Emily's return. The Mustang seemed to know, as if feeling the shifting energy in the valley. He paced more restlessly, snorting at strangers who occasionally came to look at the property, retreating at the sound of unfamiliar voices. Evan's own story, once so neatly circumscribed by loss, had become tangled with the Barretts. He remembered the nights he'd lain awake, haunted by faces he couldn't save and promises broken by fate. The act of searching, of refusing to let the past vanish, became his own way of seeking absolution. With the first true cold snap of November, the real estate agent's car appeared, kicking up gravel as it rolled up the drive. Evan watched from his porch as a woman stepped out, tall, with chestnut hair pulled back against the wind, eyes that mirrored the uncertain gray of the sky. She moved with purpose, but also with caution, as if steeling herself against the ghosts of her family's land. He waited until the agent left before approaching, journal in hand. Emily Barrett stood near the barn, staring at the sagging boards and the wild tangle of weeds, her face pinched with memory. She seemed startled to see Evan, but when he explained, briefly and gently, that he lived next door and had uncovered some of her family's history, her expression softened. Emily confessed that she hadn't set foot on the property in years, not since she left for college. Her life had taken her far from Wyndham Hollow, through a marriage that crumbled, a city job that left her empty, and now, finally, back to the threshold of her childhood. She spoke with a sadness that Evan recognized, the ache of untended roots, the uncertainty of returning to a place both familiar and strange. As they talked, Midnight watched from the shadows of the barn, his posture alert but not fearful. The Mustang seemed to sense a shift, an anticipation that prickled in the crisp air. Emily glanced toward him and frowned, not yet recognizing the horse but clearly unsettled by his presence. Evan decided to keep the story of the journal and Thomas's lost cavalry days for another time. There would be a moment for that revelation, a moment when the past could be set gently, finally, in her hands. That night, Wyndham Hollow was veiled in a hush. The fields rhymed with frost, the stars sharp and cold overhead. Evan read through the journal once more, piecing together Clara's journey after Thomas's disappearance. The entries stopped, but public records painted a stark picture. Clara had never remarried, living out her days in quiet solitude, tending the land and caring for the horses. The love she and Thomas shared, brief, burning, unfulfilled, became the axis on which her world turned. When her parents passed, Clara held fast to the barn, refusing to leave even as it decayed around her. The story of the Barretts, Evan realized, was not simply one of loss, but of endurance. The scars that haunted the land, the unspoken grief that shaped Midnight's life, were also marks of love that would not surrender. He saw it in Emily, struggling to reconcile the person she'd become with the girl she once was. He felt it in himself, too, the way the past demands to be witnessed, the way pain can be transformed into something enduring if only someone is willing to remember. With the ground between them thawing, Evan planned his next step. He would invite Emily back to the barn, share the journal, and finally reveal the thread that ran through horse, family, and land. Midnight's vigil was not yet finished, but for the first time, Evan felt certain it was nearing its end, not as a tragedy, but as a reconciliation, a long overdue reunion that would bring peace to more than just one restless soul. The wind swept sharp and wild through Wyndham Hollow as November deepened, carrying a restless energy that seemed to quicken every living thing. Evan Hayes could feel it in his bones, the sense that the story was nearing its most critical moment. The secrets long held beneath the dust of the Barrett barn pressing toward the surface. The journal was now a constant companion, its pages marked and worn from countless readings. Outside, Midnight kept his silent vigil as ever, his dark form a permanent shadow against the weathered boards. but something had changed. His posture, once proud but weighed down by sorrow, seemed now almost hopeful. Ears flicked forward, nostrils flared as if catching a scent, carried from a time before all the heartbreak. Emily Barrett returned to the property on a raw Saturday morning, the sky the color of pewter and the air tinged with the metallic promise of snow. She arrived alone this time, her stride steady but uncertain, carrying the heaviness of the past like a stone in her pocket. Evan met her at the drive, journal tucked under his arm, and together they walked across the brittle grass, boots leaving trails in the rime of frost. As they neared the barn, Midnight lifted his head and took a step forward, mane rippling in the wind. Emily stopped abruptly, her breath catching. For a moment, she simply stared at the Mustang, her eyes wide with a mix of fear, wonder, and confusion. Evan could feel the air around them grow taut with possibility, as if some invisible thread was being pulled tight. Emily took a tentative step closer. Midnight didn't retreat. Instead, he stood rooted to the spot, tail swishing, gaze fixed on her with a quiet intensity. The barn, silent witness to decades of heartache, seemed to hold its breath. Suddenly, a memory flickered in Emily's eyes, a flash of recognition so fierce it made her stagger. She whispered a single word, a name from long ago, Storm. The Mustang's ears pricked, and he whickered softly, the sound rising above the wind, impossibly familiar and impossibly alive. The shock of the moment rippled through the valley. Evan watched as Emily moved closer, one cautious step at a time, her hands shaking, her eyes brimming with tears. She reached out, palm trembling, and Midnight, Storm, closed the distance, lowering his great head into her touch. Years seemed to fall away, the bitterness of time dissolving in that one trembling connection. The horse leaned into her, eyes half-lidded, breathing her in as if she were a long-lost dream returned to life. The reunion sent a charge through everything. Evan felt goosebumps on his arms, the barn itself creaking as if relieved to bear witness to something beautiful after so many years of holding only grief. Emily wept quietly, her tears mixing with the fine mist in the air, her fingers tangling in the horse's black mane. She spoke in broken fragments, memories of a childhood spent in these fields, of riding bareback through the golden haze of summer, of a beloved horse gone missing on the day she left for college. She had always wondered what became of Storm, her questions left unanswered, her hope quietly smothered by the years and by family stories she could never quite believe. It became clear in that hush that Storm had not run away or been stolen, but had remained behind, waiting. He had kept his post at the barn, just as Thomas had once waited for Clara, as Clara had waited for news, as Emily had waited for her own sense of closure. In the strange arithmetic of grief, each act of waiting became a thread binding them all together: horse, woman, land, and memory. As the hours passed, Emily walked the property with Storm at her side, rediscovering every corner with the eyes of both the girl she had been and the woman she was now. Evan trailed behind, giving them space, feeling the story turn in a new direction. He saw how Storm's posture changed around Emily. The old weight lifted, replaced by a spark of the wild joy she described from years ago. He realized, with a quiet thrill, that the horse's long vigil was never about the barn itself, but about the return of someone who could finally complete the circle. Late that afternoon, as the light faded to gold and then to blue, Emily sat on the barn's old stone threshold, Storm's head in her lap. She spoke softly, words lost to the wind, but the peace in her face was unmistakable. Evan approached then, offering her the journal. She took it with reverence, opening to the first page, her fingers tracing the faded script of Thomas Barrett. Her ancestor, her family, her legacy. She read in silence, lips moving, the story taking root in her heart. The day ended with a kind of stillness Wyndham Hollow had not known for many years. The barn, once a tomb for memories and sorrow, now pulsed with the energy of reunion and renewal. The fields seemed brighter, the air warmer despite the season, and Evan knew that something profound had been set right. Midnight Storm stood close to Emily, no longer a ghost, but a living bridge between all that had been lost and all that could still be found. The days after Emily's reunion with Storm unfolded with a gentle inevitability, as if the story that had been locked in sorrow for so long was finally able to breathe. A stillness settled over the Barrett property, but it was not the silence of grief or neglect. It was the deep, cleansing hush that comes just before new growth. The first thin flurries of snow dusted the ground, giving the old barn a look of dignity it hadn't worn in years. Evan Hayes watched it all unfold, feeling his own spirit lifted in ways he hadn't imagined possible. Emily's decision was made almost without thought. She would not sell the property. The barn, the land, and the legacy. These things were woven through her blood and bones, now felt more precious than any price a stranger could offer. She told Evan that her return was meant to be temporary, but standing with Storm in the chilly morning sun, she realized she had been longing for roots, for home, for the sense of purpose that had slipped away in the city's clamor and the ache of her broken marriage. There was much to be done. The barn, so long neglected, had weathered storms, both literal and metaphorical. Its boards were gray and splintered, the roof sagged, and windows gaped like missing teeth. But Emily saw beauty in the ruin, saw the memories pressed into every beam and stone. With sleeves rolled up, she and Evan began the work of restoration, the physical labor a kind of communion with the past. The tools were simple, hammers, nails, brushes thick with oil paint, but the work itself felt sacred. Storm, too, seemed renewed by the change. He no longer paced restlessly at the barn's door, no longer gazed into the distance with haunted eyes. Instead, he trailed Emily from field to stable, nosing into buckets of nails, nudging her shoulder as she worked, occasionally kicking up his heels in a burst of youthful energy that defied his years. To Evan, the Mustang's transformation was proof that healing was possible, even after the longest vigil. The townsfolk, always quick to notice change, became curious about the activity at the old Barrett place. At first, they watched from a distance, their opinions whispered over the counters of the general store. But as the days passed and word spread of Emily's homecoming, neighbors appeared bearing gifts. A pie still warm from the oven, a box of old horseshoes, jars of preserves, stories that slipped easily from the past into the present. One by one, they offered their labor as well, painting, hauling timber, sharing the expertise passed down through generations. The barn's restoration became a shared effort, a community binding itself together by tending to old wounds. Evan found himself at the center of it, surprised by how natural it felt to belong. He realized that, in helping Emily and Storm, he had also found a way back to himself. Each day brought new tasks, replacing broken planks, sanding doors until the grain gleamed, patching the leaky roof. His hands, calloused from a lifetime of firefighting and loss, grew sure and steady with purpose. The aches and scars he carried did not vanish, but the weight of them became easier, made light by shared laughter and the easy companionship of Emily at his side. Inside the barn, the work uncovered relics of the past: a box of cavalry medals, a faded photograph of Thomas and Clara standing in front of the house, Storm, then just a colt, peeking curiously from behind Clara's skirt. Emily wept quietly when she found a locket tucked into the rafters, inside it a lock of chestnut hair and a tiny pressed wildflower. These were treasures not of gold or silver, but of memory, proof that love had been real, that it had survived in the quietest corners even as history moved on. The barn began to transform. Fresh paint brightened its siding, new shingles gave the roof a sturdy line, and the scent of cut wood and hay filled the air. On clear mornings, sunlight spilled through the cleaned windows, painting the floor in patterns of gold. Emily planted wildflowers along the fence, just as Clara once had, their colors defiant against the gray of November. Storm watched it all, his head high, his pride restored, finally at peace in the place where he had waited so long. As the barn came back to life, so did Emily. She and Evan fell into an easy partnership, their efforts growing into a quiet friendship that felt both old and new. Sometimes, as they worked side by side, they would pause to watch the Mustang grazing in the paddock or to listen to the wind humming through the eaves. In those moments, Evan felt a sense of belonging deeper than any he had known before. It was as if the barn's healing had reached into his own heart, stitching together pieces he thought were lost forever. The restoration, though physical, became a kind of ceremony, an honoring of what had been lost and what had endured. Emily wrote letters to relatives she had not seen in years, inviting them to visit, to witness the renewal of the family's legacy. The barn would become a place of gathering again, a touchstone for Barrett's yet to come, a home for stories not only of sorrow, but of hope and second chances. And in the center of it all stood Storm, the Mustang who had waited out the seasons and storms, carrying the weight of memory until it was finally shared and released. He was more than a horse now. He was a living testament to faithfulness, a reminder that the bonds of love can outlast the years. By the time the last snows melted and spring awakened Windham Hollow, the Barrett barn had transformed. Where once it had stood sagging and gray, crumbling beneath the weight of forgotten years, it now gleamed with fresh paint, its roof straight and proud against the open sky. The wildflowers Emily had planted began to bloom along the fence line, a riot of color that softened the hard edges of winter's memory. With every sunrise, the land seemed to pulse with a new vitality, a promise that nothing was truly lost if someone cared enough to remember and restore. The barn's restoration had drawn the community together, but it was the story behind its walls that truly united them. Word spread about Storm, the Mustang who had waited for his family for so many years, about the faded journal found in the loft, and the love and loyalty that had survived even after war, heartbreak, and loss. Neighbors who had only shared brief greetings for decades now gathered often at the Barrett place, trading stories and lending hands as the final touches were completed. The air around the property felt charged with gratitude and anticipation, as if the earth itself rejoiced at being remembered. Emily found herself changed, too. The homecoming she had once feared became a blessing, allowing her to rediscover the roots she'd tried to bury beneath years of busyness and pain. Where she once saw only the scars of her childhood, the loss, the empty barns, the silence, she now saw resilience and hope. The barn, once her grandmother Clara's refuge, had become her own. Each day she walked its length, letting her hands trail over the smooth new boards, hearing echoes of laughter, footsteps, and the whisper of horses long gone. Storm remained at her side, his spirit brighter than ever. Each morning he would greet her with a nicker, pressing his soft muzzle to her shoulder as if to say, "We made it." He ran the fields with the energy of a young colt, tossing his head and kicking up his heels, no longer weighed down by sorrow. To Emily, Storm was more than a connection to her past. He was proof that love endured, that waiting was not wasted, and that reunion was always possible, even when it seemed hopeless. Evan Hayes, too, found himself transformed by the story. The cottage next door became more than a retreat from pain. It was now a home that pulsed with warmth and friendship. The long days spent repairing the barn had healed wounds inside him that he'd thought permanent. Where once he'd counted his days in cups of coffee and silent hours, he now found meaning in the rhythm of shared work, in the simple pleasures of community, in the presence of Emily and Storm. The memories of his own losses had not faded, but they no longer defined him. Instead, they blended into the larger tapestry of healing and hope that had taken root at Barrett Barn. The dedication day was set for late spring, a gentle Sunday when the hills blushed green and the scent of apple blossoms drifted down from the orchard. Evan helped Emily hang a fresh sign above the barn's wide doors. Barrett Barn, a place for new beginnings. Invitations went out to family, neighbors, and even strangers who had heard the story and wanted to be part of it. The entire valley seemed to wake early that morning, and by noon the lane was lined with cars and horses, voices rising in cheerful greeting as people poured onto the property. Chairs were set up in the meadow, and tables groaned beneath the weight of homemade pies, cornbread, and lemonade. Children ran between the trees, their laughter a bright thread in the air, while the elders reminisced about days gone by. Storm stood by the barn, regal and calm, accepting pats and praise from everyone who passed. For many, seeing him there, healthy, home, and free, brought tears and smiles in equal measure. He had become a living legend, a symbol of steadfast loyalty, his story woven into the fabric of the community. The dedication ceremony itself was simple, but heavy with meaning. Emily spoke first, her voice clear and steady as she thanked everyone who had helped restore the barn and honor her family's memory. She shared the story of Thomas and Clara, the journal Evan had found, and the decades-long vigil Storm had kept. She spoke of healing and forgiveness, of the courage it took to return, and the beauty of starting over. There was a hush as she finished, and for a moment, the only sound was the soft snort of Storm beside her. Evan said a few words, too, not about firefighting or loss, but about belonging, about finding purpose where he least expected it. He thanked Emily for her trust and the community for their welcome. He looked out over the crowd and felt, for the first time in years, a true sense of peace. A small plaque was unveiled by the barn door, bearing the names of Thomas Barrett, Clara Evans Barrett, and Storm, a tribute not only to their endurance, but to the spirit of hope that now filled the place. As the afternoon drifted on, people lingered, sharing food and stories, their laughter echoing through the fields. Children rode Storm, guided by Emily, their joy infectious, their faces flushed with excitement. As dusk approached, the community gathered for one last moment, standing together, hands joined, as the sun dipped below the hills and the barn glowed in the golden light. It was a celebration not just of what had been restored, but of what had been found: friendship, forgiveness, and the courage to begin again. When the last car left and the stars began to shimmer above, Emily, Evan, and Storm stood together in the quiet. The barn stood tall and whole behind them, its windows catching the moonlight. The fields were still, but the air was alive with memory and promise. In that hush, Evan felt certain of one thing: stories like these never truly end. They ripple outward, touching lives in ways unseen, reminding all who listen that hope is always just a little farther down the road, waiting for someone brave enough to answer its call.